Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Diabetes Association's webinar, Diabetes Advocacy and Engaging Government. My name is Amanda Thambiraja, and I'm the CDA's Government Relations and Advocacy Director for Ontario. I'll be your host for tonight. Throughout the presentation, you may type in the Q&A box located at the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you use this box for any questions you may have along the way, and either our presenter or I will be happy to answer at the end of each major section. Resources, downloadable PDFs, are available in the top right corner of your screen. As well, we will be displaying a few polling questions throughout the presentation. We would love your participation in these questions to gauge who our audience members are. Please note that your answers are completely anonymous. Also note that you are able to customize your screen to expand or collapse any of the screens that you see. So feel free to adjust them as needed by dragging down the bottom right-hand corner. The presentation itself will be about 40 to 45 minutes in length, with time at the end of each major section for questions. It's important to note that this presentation will be recorded and posted to the Canadian Diabetes Association's website at a later date. The first part of today's presentation provides an analysis on the federal election. The second part is on Government Relations 101. You'll notice some of the government examples and policy asks pertain to Ontario. This is because our Ontario advocates are holding a Diabetes Day at our provincial legislature on November 4th. For Ontario advocates, please note that I will provide more information on our policy asks prior to Queen's Park Day. For everyone else, please note that the advocacy tools you learned today will be applicable to any government. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I would like to ask our first polling question. What do diabetes advocates do? A, increase the awareness about the seriousness of diabetes, support and promote the Diabetes Charter for Canada, influence the policies of government, business, and the public, or D, all of the above. We'll have about 10 seconds to answer. Yay, everyone answered all of the above. You're all experts. But just for anyone who doesn't know, our Diabetes Charter outlines the responsibilities of government, employers, schools, healthcare practitioners, and of course, people with diabetes and their families. So the Diabetes Charter presents a common vision that all people living with diabetes in Canada should be given the opportunity to optimally manage their diabetes and achieve their full health potential through comparable access to needed care and support. Since the Charter was launched, almost 26,000 Canadians have signed it. The federal government and all provincial governments have indicated their support for the Charter. So I encourage everyone, I strongly encourage all of you to sign the Diabetes Charter if you haven't already. It's available at diabetes.ca/charter. So now I would like to welcome our speaker, Mike Van Solen from Navigator, one of Canada's leading communications firms, and thank him for joining us today. Before turning it over to Mike, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. As Managing Principal of Navigator, Mike helps leading organizations reach and engage their most important audiences. Before joining Navigator, Mike founded and ran a successful boutique public affairs and communications firm with offices in Toronto and Ottawa. He has served on countless political campaigns, and his posts in government have included Chief of Staff to an Ontario Minister and Director of Communications in Ottawa. So without further ado, I present to you Mike Van Solen.
Hello, everybody. Amanda, thanks so much for that introduction. I really look forward to having the chance this evening to lead you through two presentations, as it was mentioned. The first piece is going to look at the federal election, and the second one, as Amanda mentioned, will get into the tools you can use to conduct advocacy on behalf of the Diabetes Association. So without further ado, I just need to make sure I know how to move the slides. Is everybody, I hope everybody's seeing the title slide, Government Relations. Great. So the first part that I want to talk about is the federal election. And the basis of this is a post-election major research study that we conducted. But the study actually began before the election. We undertook a program of research that included 4 waves of quantitative polling. We used this polling in the months leading up to the election to really probe with Canadians what were the issues that they cared about most, what were the reasons that motivated them to put the X beside the name that they ultimately chose on the ballot. As soon as the election results came in, we immediately conducted focus groups across the country. These focus groups took place in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Quebec City, and Halifax. Once we were armed with all that information, we were really able to unpack what it was that motivated Canadians to make the choices that they did. What was really clear in every session, in every region of the country, when we met Canadians, they loudly and clearly told us that this election was about change. It wasn't about the economy. It wasn't about strengthening the middle class. It wasn't about national child care, but it was about change. We say it was about back to the future. Voters made a deliberate decision to restore the values that they viewed as traditionally defining Canada and Canadian society, in particular civility, kindness, and inclusion. The time for a change piece was super, super strong. We saw this in the polling. It really came out. It was a ratio of 3 to 1 that Canadians said it was time for a change. And further, the conviction with which they believed that was very telling. Almost half of all respondents who reported that it was definitely time for a change. By contrast, only 1 in 10, 9%, took the view that now was definitely not time for a change. So, why did Canada vote against Harper? What we know from the research very clearly was the strong demand for change. It was actually personal. It was actually about Stephen Harper. They didn't view that he reflected their values. His approval ratings were negative, and we saw them from when we began the polling in late winter, early spring of this year. Through the course of the election, we saw his approval ratings continue to fall. By October, the negative impressions were held by a majority of Canadians. So, why did people vote against Harper? In their words, they saw him as divisive, exclusionary, insular, unconsultative, and mean-spirited. What was really fascinating to us is in the focus groups across the country, we heard many people sort of consistently point out this idea that the Canadian government was muzzling scientists. And for them, that was really that captured the thought of all that was wrong with really Mr. Harper. When we got into the research and talked to people, what we found is they weren't necessarily against many of the policies of the Conservative Party. They weren't necessarily there was decent views about how he managed the economy and on a couple other policy points. But he himself, captured by that idea of him muzzling scientists, that sort of personified in their mind what was wrong with Harper and by extension his governments. I'll also say that the NECAB issue that came to play late in the election was viewed very cynically by everyone, and many actually described that as offensive. So, why did Canadians vote for Trudeau? Trudeau's strong performance resulted in a significant improvement in assessments of him. The long election definitely benefited him. The expectations for Trudeau had been driven so low, in part, I suppose ironically, or as a strategic misstep, by the Conservatives, who had tried to convince Canadians that he couldn't even tie his shoes. And then once he had that really long election to prove to Canadians that he was a capable leader, someone who would actually inspire them. It really gave them a lot of time to sort of reevaluate their opinions of who he was. So Trudeau, what did they see about him? They saw him as open, honest, civil, inclusive, and accountable. All of these attributes worked against the attempt to position Mr. Trudeau as not ready. In fact, he was seen as capable and substantive. He conveyed values that were judged to be as a return to traditional Canadian civility. So, why did Canadians shift away from Mulcair? Certainly what we saw early and through the first many weeks of the election, where the polls were all sort of split, one-third, 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 with many Canadians, and even at times the NDP led in the election. So clearly many Canadians had parked sort of their vote with Mulcair. That's what they told pollsters. But what we found is, as the election went on, it began to move, and of course it moved towards Trudeau. Despite the NDP efforts to move to the center, a lot of people didn't fully trust Mulcair's repositioning. Several participants in groups across the country described him as still being a socialist. They saw the pledge to balance the budgets. While that actually was consistent with their values, they saw it as being somehow insincere on his part to do that and out of character. So, what we saw was that that was really sort of important. While many Canadians had parked their vote with Mulcair, the way it played out over the course of the election, in particular the NECAB issue, really came to hurt Mr. Mulcair. He had a position that was counter to the views of most Quebecers on that issue. And when his vote in Quebec began to collapse, what we saw was sort of the national polling numbers showing that Trudeau was going ahead. So why this was important was that Canadians in other parts of the country, seeing that Trudeau was actually moving ahead in the polls because of Mulcair's unpopular position on that issue in Quebec, they began to view Trudeau as the most likely agent for change. Clearly, Trudeau got the wind in his sails at the right time. So, next the question is what did Canadians actually vote for? What I really want to get across to you is this was very much a personality, on the highest level, this was very much a personality campaign where people wanted to get rid of Mr. Harper. At the end of the day, they looked at the other two. They tried to decide, make a judgment, who was the best agent for change, and clearly Trudeau was that guy for them. The values, tone, and approach to politics that Mr. Trudeau represented, not the policy so much, were the more appealing means to an end and led voters to mark their ballots for the Liberals. So then the question is, what did Canadians see as the issues in the campaign? So, number one, far and away, throughout our quantitative research leading up to the election, it was jobs and the economy was number one, consistent throughout. Very interestingly, infrastructure was the other big piece that Canadians said was important. They all recognized that roads and transit were lagging, and they wanted to see significant investments in that area. And also interestingly, a balanced budget was important to many Canadians. They saw that as kind of a core value and something that was really important. So then the question becomes, how did Trudeau get away with saying he was going to go into deficit spending? And when we probed on that, we really found that people were willing to accept the idea of modest deficit spending if the circumstances were right. And what we uncovered is clearly Trudeau was able to make the case that in this time of low interest rates, with such a backlog in infrastructure, this was a good time. And they were willing to accept, providing there was a plan to get out of deficit, going into deficit for a short period. So, where does Mr. Trudeau have permission to move ahead? What he clearly has permission to work on is the economy. They like his economic plan, and the Liberals really have permission to move ahead with that, with their plan. There is some caution, and the Liberals would be advised to move slowly on some of the pieces of their platform. In particular, they should really work hard to stick to their deficit commitments that they made, and a plan to get out of deficit will be very important. Further, what Canadians are really looking for is there's a strong craving for civility, integrity, inclusiveness, and openness in government. Further, they want a government that is accountable, transparent, more compassionate, again, inclusive, and respectful. Given that demand for change was met and the Prime Minister designate exemplifies a return to Canadian values, Canadians expressed notable optimism about the future under a Liberal government. Mr. Trudeau ran a great campaign beginning to end. He was able to dispel many of the expectations that were created for him, and he offered the hope that Canadians were looking for, a change in tone that was so critical, and at the end of the day, he was that agent for change that Canadians were looking for to turn the page and move Mr. Harper out of office. With that, that brings the first part of this presentation about the federal election to a close. I'm really interested to know if there's any questions. Amanda, maybe I can turn it over to you. If questions have come in about the federal election, what happened. Happy to answer any questions about what worked and the choices that Canadians made.
Thanks, Mike. So one of the questions from Tammy is, what are some of the values and potential policies from the Liberal Party that help support the not-for-profit sector? Where does science, medical health care, and partnering with not-for-profit organizations come into play for change in the federal government?
So, great question. Because this wasn't a policy-driven election, some of this, in truth, we're going to have to find out. One of the key pieces, I think, for Trudeau was an improved sort of collaboration, a desire to work with first the provinces and others in a more collaborative way to address sort of the big issues. I think it's going to be important to, as you approach the federal government, to sort of align your values and your proposals to their philosophy, which is very much one of creating a caring civil society. I think the Diabetes Association will be really well positioned to align your ask with the values of the incoming government. What's going to be important in the early days, we'll have to wait, but very soon, beginning of next month, we're going to see who the cabinet is. And he has a diverse group of people to choose from to put in the cabinet. So the values and the backgrounds of those people in the respective ministries will be important. And we're also going to get a throne speech before the end of the year, which will be very indicative of their early priorities.
Great, thank you, Mike. The next question is, how is health going to be positioned with the new government? Will it play a bigger role, or will it be left primarily to the provinces with federal money?
You know, it's a great question. This will be very interesting. You know, in years past, health was always, you know, a #1 priority of Canadians, and it's something that doesn't rank as high in orders of priority as it had in the, for example, the Chrétien years. But where the Harper government very much was hands off with the provinces, and of course the provinces have a big responsibility for healthcare delivery. The sense we have is the Liberals are going to have a goal to very much lay out a national vision and work with the provinces on delivering that. You know, one of the ways we're going to see that is that Trudeau has made a commitment to meet with the premiers again, meet with the first ministers on a regular basis. This is something Harper hadn't done since 2008. So in part, your provincial advocacy efforts will be important as well, because those ministers are going to have, on a provincial level, health ministers and premiers are going to have an opportunity to make a pitch to the federal government about the health needs that they have in the province and how they want to do it. So I think what's important is with the federal government, they do have visions of doing big things. Gerald Butts is going to be, was the campaign manager. He'll play a very key role in the Prime Minister's office. And we saw him in Ontario with McGuinty not shy away from laying out big programs. So I think it's going to be an ambitious government, one looking to work with the provinces, and that's probably where the opportunity is for health to change in how it's delivered in Canada.
Thank you, Mike. I think we have time for one more question. I know there are quite a few that came in, but we'll try to answer them after the presentation or at the end of the presentation, depending on how much time we have. So the last question says, the Liberals seem very interested in Aboriginal First Nations issues. From a diabetes perspective, and is this an opportunity to look at particular diabetes issues for this at-risk population? Is this the kind of alignment you're talking about?
For sure, that's a great observation, and I will say that I think that's a great way to align your work with the priorities of the incoming government. And everything I'm told is the Prime Minister designate is quite sincere in this piece. He really wants to change how the federal government engages and works with the First Nations groups. So that would be a perfect way for the CDA to align its values and asks with the federal government.
Thank you, Mike. I think we can continue on to our second section now.
Great. So in this section, we're calling this Government Relations 101, and this is really my attempt to share some best practices and some ideas for how you can more effectively advocate on behalf of the CDA in your own lives and every day in your own lives and work. The first thing we're going to do is do a little poll question. So it should be up now, and it's a simple question of, have you ever lobbied or advocated before? If you could put your answer in the next few moments, and just to give a sense of how many people have experience doing this. Okay. Great. Thanks for participating. Looks like 72% of you have lobbied or advocated before, and about a quarter of you haven't. So that's a great mix. It shows there's some experience on the call, and some people are coming at this for the first time. I'm going to really approach this from giving everyone the basic tools to use in their approach with government officials. So I put up a picture of President Putin because I guess he represents the toughest meeting you're ever going to have. But what I want to say is, you shouldn't expect to meet someone as tough looking as Mr. Putin. And I think, and even if you do meet some tough people, I hope I'm going to give you some tools to handle that. I have another poll question for you. Have you tried to meet with your local elected official provincially or federally before? Give everyone a few moments. Great. So it's about the same proportion, 70% to 30% who have done that. The tools, as Amanda said at the beginning of the program, are really meant to be applicable for whichever level of government you are reaching out to. That said, some of my examples and pieces we go through are provincial, are Ontario, because we did do this on this past Sunday with a group of Ontario advocates. So here's the Ontario makeup. And this is, the point I want to make is that whatever the makeup is of the provincial government, the federal government, what's important to remember is that these are really just people. And to get to know people, you need to know and get to learn a little bit about them. So whether they're doctors, in particular, the homework before your meetings, what are their backgrounds? Doctors, small business owners, lawyers, these things are important. And these are the ways you can think about how you reach out to them. Maybe you want to think about who in your organization is best or on your team is best to go talk with them. If someone is a farmer, maybe someone in your background thinks that they would have a great chance to relate with them because they have a similar background. But really, it's not about just matching backgrounds. It's about being interested in who they are beyond the office they hold, and really to demystifying it a little bit and realize they're just people, and you don't need to be intimidated, again, by the office they hold. The other context beyond the person themselves is the party they represent, because while they are independent elected members, they are members of parties, and the parties are the philosophy of the party is often shared in whole or in large part, I would suggest, by the members themselves. So, for example, with the Ontario Liberal Party, understanding the values, of course being the governing party, understanding their values, what they care about, will offer you some important hints as to the members in the party and where their headspace may be on key issues. Again, with the Ontario PCs, this is a part. Really look at where a party is in its life cycle. The Ontario PCs, by example, have just got a new leader in. They are really searching for what their platform is going to be. The Ontarians rejected them quite strongly in the last election. So this is a party that doesn't have strongly formed positions today, but is probably looking for great ideas, probably looking for pieces and policies that they can run on in the next election. So a great time to get into them and make your case as to why the CDA and the type of work it's trying to do could fit very well into the priorities of the Ontario PC party. And again, the NDP, same thing. Really think about your ask and what you're trying to do. Think about the populations that the NDP may be closest to, where the the constituents that they would care a lot about, and align your work and your advocacy with the areas of interest they may have. So tips for GR success. Let me just say first that you really are the best advocates for the work you're doing. People who have a background in it, who've worked in it, who have themselves or family members impacted by it, are the best people to tell the story and to bring forward the asks and the priorities of the Canadian Diabetes Association. There can be, government relations professionals. There can be hired executives who do this work. But it's my belief, proven out over years, that people themselves are the best spokespeople for their organization. So I say this to deputize you, and so that you know your work and your outreach to government can be super effective. So when you actually meet with an elected official, there's a few goals that you have. One is you want to build long-term relationships. And this should be your headspace and thought process going into the meeting. This isn't meant to be a one-night stand. You are looking to have that first meeting, but to have sort of ongoing dialogue with them. You want to move that relationship from polite to value added, and that's how you help build a longer term relationship. So in your meetings, as you're going through stuff and potentially they ask you questions, I'll give the example of, if you're from Brampton and you're with a Brampton MPP, and you highlight that there's a great program taking place in the hospital in the community, and they don't know about it, and they ask you some questions. That's a great opportunity, if you don't have the information at your fingertips, to say, hey, let me come back to you, or let me come back to your office with that information. Let me have the executive director of that program give you a call. Maybe there's an opportunity for you to come and visit and see what that program is all about. These are ways you add value to the relationship in the meeting, and you help turn it into the beginning of a longer-term relationship and dialogue. Further, I'll say, and this is a key point that gets, I think, not enough importance, is don't discriminate. Every MPP meeting, MLA meeting, MP meeting can be important. And even if the person seems so far from any real decision-making power within the party, know that you are playing the long game, and taking time to meet with that person who doesn't seem important today, or further, the staffer who's in the office who just seems like the junior staffer working in a backbench MLA's office, can over time, in a few years, be in a position that would really surprise you and have a lot of influence. So your messages to those people are critical. One of the ways I make this point is going back to old bios. Here's Kathleen Wynne from 2005. If you would have met with her then, you might not have thought she would be a super important person the way she is today. She'd only been elected for a couple years. She was a parliamentary assistant, and that maybe that meeting didn't seem super valuable to you. But of course, today she is the Premier of the province. And you go through all three provincial leaders in Ontario, and you'll see that there was a time, Patrick Brown maybe being the best example of this. If you had met with him, only a few years ago, he was on the backbench in the Conservative caucus in Ottawa. He'd been there for years, yet the Prime Minister had never thought he was, you may view the Prime Minister never thought he was capable enough to go into cabinet. How could this guy be important? Well, flip ahead 2 years. Now he's the leader of the Ontario PC party, and he will have a chance in a couple short years to be Premier. Same is true for Andrea Horvath in 2008. She may not have seemed like someone who was going to have a lot of influence. She's already had one chance to become premier. She'll get another chance in a couple of years. So framing the narrative, this is the important part for you to take away, I think, is how do you approach a meeting? How do you approach your engagement with the elected official? Your narrative I see this as having 4 parts. You're highlighting the issue, you're telling your connection to the issue, you're explaining why it's important to the government or political party, and you're providing a solution. So really simply, I think of this as having 4 parts. Whether it's whether you have 2 minutes with them or you have a half hour with them, you try to move through this sequence. 1, introducing the issue and who you are. 2, explaining your connection to the issue, how it has relevance for you. 3, why the issue has relevance for them, which we'll unpack in a little bit. And 4th, what's the solution? So think of those 4 steps. The issue, introducing it, your connection to it, why they should care about it, and the solution. I always put this point in here, knowledge of the issue can be an obstacle. Sometimes I refer to, others have referred to it, I'm stealing the phrase, but as the curse of knowledge. You know this so well. You know the issue in details that you may hope the MLA or the MPP cares about it in that much detail or understands it, but likely they don't. So it's important to really think about your issue in layman's terms. Talk to it at a higher level. You're not dumbing it down, but you're just trying to get it across in a way that they can easily understand. Like most people, they may not stop you to say they don't get a key point. So just think about how you can keep it really simple and present it to them. So some key points here, again, plain language, be concise, make it relevant. How is it of a connection to them, whether that's in their riding, whether that's because they represent a population like First Nations. They have a large First Nations community in their riding that could be important to them. Make it relevant, and make it personal, your own story. So again, I won't spend too much time here, but you really have to think about whatever your ask is. It's important to know before you go to that meeting, or long time before you go to that meeting, when you're making the request for that meeting, what are the pieces you really want to talk about? Clearly, there's a whole bunch of issues as a diabetes advocate you may care about, but being focused and picking the ones, 1 or 2 that you want to advance in that conversation, where you can talk about the problem, you can talk about the very specific solution that you want to advance. Those things are important. I'm not sure if this is true in all markets across the country, but I know in Ontario for the Lobby Day coming up, these are 2 of the issues that are going to be brought forward. Certainly the maybe they've actually changed a little bit. We worked on Sunday; they're a little bit different. But what I really want to leave you with the idea is that you have to understand what you're going into the meeting to ask for, and you're not going to be able to cover the waterfront and all the issues. You want to be clear and concise of what you're tackling and what your ask is, what solution you're looking for. So how do you bolster your argument? And this gets into that relevant piece. Local. Like real estate, location matters. The riding, where they're elected matters. If you can think about why this issue is relevant for them, for their population, for their constituents, for what's taking place in their riding, you strengthen your argument. Economy and jobs. this may not be work you can do on your own, and you'll need the support of the Canadian Diabetes Association. But we saw in the earlier presentation that economy and jobs is an issue that's super important to Canadians. So that makes it super important to elected officials. And for example, it may be about having where you can find information, for example, that diabetes is reducing productivity, taking people out of the workforce. That's not the health, that's a tangential peripheral issue to the core issue probably, but it may be something that is particularly relevant to the MPP or MLA. So in part, you may want to understand what the person is like. Is he or she quite fixated on jobs and the economy? Because then you may want to arm yourself with a little bit of information about that. Tying it to the political priorities. So I won't spend much time. There was the perfect example in the earlier presentation about the Liberals federally making a priority of First Nations issues. That's how you tie your issue to the priorities of the party. And finally, this gets glossed over, but think about how you can make the case to the elected official that there's an opportunity for them to make a difference. This gets lost, I suppose, in the cynicism that many of us have about government. But when you meet elected officials on an individual basis, the truth is that at least they all started out, and I think for the most part, throughout their careers, they really are there to make a difference. They want to find those things that they can latch onto and work at and again, help make a difference. So where there's an opportunity where you can make the case to them that there's something that they can be important to this issue, that they can really help advance the cause, that may well be something that helps motivate them to get involved. Again, share your personal story. I think this is really important and makes it more real. The truth is they are meeting with people from different groups all the time, and usually it's sort of cold policy discussions that take place. What can really help your issue stand out is the personal story you're able to tell. The trick, I suppose, is to try to make the personal story relevant to the specific policy ask you have, and the specific, make it instructive as to the solution that you're going to be asking for. Your personal story is very important. I've talked about this briefly, but really find ways to localize it. How do you make a connection between your ask, the policy solution you're proposing, and where they are from? There's an example offered here of southwestern Ontario, and that is helpful. It may not just be the riding, but you might have to think about other ways to localize it. It may be broader than just the riding. It may be the region. It may be it may be something very close to them. So you don't have to confine yourself necessarily to the riding, but really think about sort of the area or region they come from and see that you can bring something relevant to them from it. And it may just be that you're from the same region and you can talk about it in a first-person perspective from the communities that they know. That can really be helpful and help make your message more impactful. Another poll question for folks. If you have lobbied or advocated to elected officials, have you ever had a negative experience in a meeting? All right. Great. So 70% of people said no, they have not had a negative experience, but a quarter of you have had a negative experience. These meetings don't always go great. I don't think many of you will find that when you go in, the person's going to be mean. He's going to be how we might imagine, Putin on his worst day. But But sometimes they don't go great. Sometimes they're distracted. Sometimes there's a million things that go on. They're human. They're humans, and there can be other things going on in their life that you don't appreciate. But they can be. The other thing to really watch for, and I encourage folks, is what I think is more common is that not that they're mean, is that they're just really polite but don't really seem particularly engaged. I sort of call this the death by 1,000 sort of smiles and nods. So where you see that, where it feels like they're going through a bit of the motions and they're smiling and being nice, but you're not particularly engaging, ask questions. Try to draw out of them, like, how have you experienced diabetes? In your life, are you aware of diabetes programs in your community? Have you engaged in these issues? The best advice I can give is try to draw them out. If you find they're just smiling and nodding as you're going through your presentation, stop, ask them some questions, try to draw them in, and I think you may find you kind of get past sort of the glassy-eyed stare. So, making meeting magic. I just encourage you to use the tools that we've talked about today. In particular, think of those 4 pieces of a meeting. Introducing yourself and the issue, explaining how your part in it, the relevance of the issue to you, talking about the relevance of the issue to them and what you're trying to do, and make sure you have a solution that you want to present. You'd be stopping short if you just highlighted the problem, talked about your part and their part in it, without really outlining what's your ask, what's the solution, and what are you looking for from them. Great. I hope everyone found that instructive, and I'm really look forward to helping answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mike. That was very informative. So one of our questions is, if you have a Liberal MPP, is there a route to influencing the PCs or the NDP?
So on a local level, I assume that this means, if without going beyond I'm imagining this question to mean if you're in your riding and you have an elected Liberal MPP, how do you reach the PCs and the NDP? Without going out of the riding, I wouldn't see on a riding level you reaching out to the political, the party, But I think that really falls upon people in other ridings, even if in the Ontario context, even if you have a Conservative MPP, you should be, just because they're not in government, that shouldn't prevent you from going and making the case to them. On a provincial level, there's probably opportunities to brief the parties. This is where one of the reasons you may go to opposition party leaders. But a great place for everyone to start is with their locally elected MPP from whichever party they may be from.
Thank you, Mike. One of our other questions asks, how do I distinguish diabetes from cancer, heart and stroke, and all other health issues?
Yeah. So there's no shortage of different health issues out there, and I think it's about being dedicated to the sort of the long-term game. It's not about who can make their their issue the most painful, the most sympathetic. It's really just making a case, and I think what I'll say is having solutions that are doable. There's so many issues that seem intractable, where the MPP may feel he or she really can't. What can I really do about it? But I think it's about having policy asks that make sense, and solutions that are achievable. Programs that, you're not looking for the government to go bankrupt. It's presenting really practical solutions where the MPP can identify that this makes sense, this is doable, it can have a real impact in people's lives, and I can help bring it about.
Thanks, Mike. I think we have time to go back to one or two of the federal election questions. One person had a question about the methodology used for your analysis. They wanted to know why only people in larger cities were polled.
So, people in the 4 waves of quantitative research, people were polled, across all sort of demos, urban, rural, and and there was 1,200 interviews done in each wave, so over almost 5,000 people in total throughout, and that was balanced for age and demo, urban and rural. The focus groups, I think some of them were suburban. I just mentioned the big rough centers where they were, but there were multiple focus groups done. I'm pretty confident some of them were done in rural, like suburban at least, areas. I'm not sure that we did focus groups in the rural areas, but they do bring in people from around those communities.
Thanks, Mike. Another question was healthcare and environment a non-issue for Canadians?
Environment was an issue. They don't, around like 2008, 2007, 2008, when Al Gore was coming out with his movie, and climate change was really a hot topic. That was probably about the one time in the last 10 years where the environment was the #1 policy priority of Canadians. Really, since the economic downturn of 2008, when people order their priorities, it's a lot lower. It's been about jobs in the economy as we exist in sort of these soft economic times. But we did see, health was kind of not a non-issue, but it was a minor issue in this campaign. I think it's because it's seen as just such a difficult nut to crack, and it's the parties themselves have a difficult time distinguishing their positions from the others on it. But the environment was important. Certainly a change in how we deal with the energy sector. Really critical is, Trudeau talked about climate change. His commitment to go to Paris later next month was seen as really important, and a really a significant change in how we're perceived on the world stage on this issue. And there's commitments around dealing with carbon across the country. So I'd say environment was important, and it was important as a distinguishing feature for the Liberals from the Conservatives in particular. But healthcare was less of at least an issue for this campaign.
Thanks, Mike. And there's one more question going back to our government relations part of tonight's webinar. The person asked, if I should be able to present to the government official and it goes okay the first time, then they say they want to think about it or leave the idea with them, how does one continue the next step or other people groups to be involved? So I guess the question is, what's the next step after presenting to a government official?
I'd say one of the things you really want to do is when they're asking questions, is finding opportunities for follow-up. So it's actually great if they ask you a question that you don't have an answer to at the tip of your tongue, because that gives you an opportunity to come back to them and their staff with that information. it's all about how do you build sort of a long-term relationship. And it may not just be you individually building that relationship, but it may be you as a representative of the CDA helping to build a long-term relationship for the CDA with that official. We don't need to think about it entirely on an individual basis. But it's about trying to engage, have questions, find reasons to follow up with them, find reasons. You can politely, you don't want to inundate them, but if you've done something and there was a spark of interest and there's an update, it's perfectly within your rights. If you've mentioned a program taking place and it launches a couple months later, to send a follow-up note to that office and say, I met with the MLA. We mentioned this program. I thought he or she would really like to see this news story about the program finally opening its doors.
Thanks, Mike. That concludes our question period. For any questions that we weren't able to answer, please feel free to send us an email at advocacy@diabetes.ca. I will also follow up with one or two people who asked questions we couldn't get to. So I just wanted to make one last note for our newer advocates. Advocacy is never just one meeting. It's a sustained long-term effort. For example, we may ask you to attend one of our diabetes days at your local legislature. We may ask you to help with engaging federal members of parliament, and we may also ask you to make individual efforts to engage your local elected representatives throughout the year. I'd say many times it's like being in the reserves. You won't always know when you're going to be called upon, but we may ask you suddenly to help with an initiative. So that concludes our webinar for today. I'd like to sincerely thank Mike for joining us today and all of you for taking time out of your evening. It's been a great learning experience. Just a reminder, our webinars will be available online to everyone in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.